Okay, everyone. So I was sitting here the other night and I started watching some ECW and I was listening to an old interview that good old Shane Douglas gave, the franchise Shane Douglas. And I watched the episode of ECW where Shane Douglas throws down the NWA belt. And I see the interview with Dennis Coralluzzo at the end. And just top of my head, I go, man, my good friend, the great Brian Last, he knew Dennis pretty well. Let me pick his brain about that night and anything else he may know about it. And again, I don't know what kind of just caught my attention with this whole ECW thing, but it's been almost 24 years. I figured I'd go back and watch it, and I did. So, Brian, two things. One, thank you for doing the show again. And two, I told you it wouldn't be 2 years before I bring you back on, since you gave me such a hard time last time.
Aloha, Mike. A pleasure to be on the Booking the Territory podcast once again. Boy, I'm hearing the echo really loud in my headset right now. I don't know if it's me or if it's the world, but oh, there we go. It's a little better. But listen, I know last time I busted your chops a little bit about it being so long since the last time I was on. This time, I think too soon. You should have waited a little longer, quite frankly.
Can't keep you happy. Damn it.
Yeah. Good to be here, though. Good to be here.
I hear you, man. So, Brian and I were talking off air before we started, and Brian is obviously familiar with this incident, probably more familiar than most people since he and Dennis Coralluzzo were such good friends. So that's why I wanted to bring him on. Like, I don't know Shane Douglas. I never knew Dennis. The only people I know that would be familiar with this incident personally would be you and Cornette. So as we jump into this thing, prior to that NWA title incident, I've heard Shane Douglas, and this is kind of stuff before the whole tournament. I've heard Shane Douglas say on an interview that there was friction between the independent promotions with the one that Dennis ran and I guess the one that Paul and Todd were running at the time. So got twofold questions here. What do you know about that friction? Who fired, I guess, the first shot in that friction and all of that, hoopla that was going on around the indie scene back then that you could enlighten me and everybody else on that, hasn't quite heard this or isn't quite familiar with it, if you do know about the friction and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, you can go way back with some of this stuff. I guess, so I don't have to go too long with it. A couple of important points here. We're talking about, the period you're talking about is, I want to say August, September 1994.
Right.
And everyone's relationship went back further. Dennis knew Paul Heyman since at least 88,
right,
since he started coming into Philadelphia. And by all accounts, they had there wasn't a very jovial relationship, which Dennis especially had with wrestlers and wrestling personalities he became friends with. There was some kind of standoffishness between them. So there's that. Dennis is involved in promoting local wrestling in New Jersey and some in Pennsylvania. Larry Sharp is his partner. Eventually, Dennis does it on his own. At the same time, Todd Gordon's involved with what's happening in Philadelphia with Joel Goodhart, who has a radio show, and then starts promoting these indie super shows, bringing in people from Japan and all over the country to appear on them. And Todd, I believe he did some ring announcing. I don't know if he was financially behind any of it, but Todd was involved in that. Todd was on, if you remember, there was a 1990, I want to say CBS, because I think it was Connie Chung, although it may have been CNN, right around the time of WrestleMania 6, right after that, maybe in May, they did a special on wrestling, and they showed El Gigante's debut, and then they showed some stuff from WrestleMania, and they showed a family at home in Pennsylvania, and that was Todd Gordon and his wife and his kids. So that was 1990. So now let's fast forward ahead a little bit. 1992, Joel Goodhart's TWA is done. He just financially couldn't do it anymore. They canceled before an upcoming match that was going to be between Nature Boy Buddy Landel and Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, who was coming out of retirement in his 70s to wrestle Nature Boy Buddy Landel. Unfortunately, it didn't happen because the money fell through and Goodhart disappeared for a number of years. And then all of a sudden, Philadelphia didn't have any sort of independent wrestling outlet. Dennis was running mostly in Jersey, Southern Jersey, sometimes Central Jersey, eventually sometimes Northern Jersey. But Southern Jersey and Philadelphia are very close to each other. You would hear about sometimes when they would run shows on the same day, it was a battle across a river, and that simplifies it a little bit. But if Dennis was running a show in West Deptford and ECW was running a show in Philadelphia, it was relatively close by. And it ended up being a lot of that around this time in 94, a few months before this. But In 92, Todd Gordon starts ECW, and they start running really in the early shows are in a bar, and it's just a bunch of local guys, and eventually, Jimmy Snuka's there, and, Jimmy Snuka's actually a local guy when you really think about it, even though he's a guy fresh off WWF TV at that point, still in 92. He had been on there in 91. Jimmy Snuka, they got other guys, and Todd Gordon makes a deal with Eddie Gilbert for Eddie Gilbert to move to Philadelphia and become his booker, and he's going to invest the money that he's been making, his own money, and he's going to fund ECW, and they're going to get on TV. They get on Sports Channel in Philadelphia. And I think it's the first episode, and I could be wrong. It could be one of the early ones. It's on the WWE Network. They show clips of Eddie Gilbert versus Terry Funk in, I want to say, a Texas Death Match. It may have just been a no-holds-barred match. It's like handheld footage from ringside. And that's a Dennis Carluzzo show. You see Dennis in the video. And they brought that feud into ECW. Once Eddie started booking, he brought Terry in. So that feud had been going. It was on Dennis' show, at least that one Dennis show. And then ECW did it. So there's that. In that ECW is now using guys that Dennis had been using, like Eddie Gilbert, like Terry Funk, a lot of the local guys. And then at some point, and I don't know how much was overt, I don't know what was said, but a lot of those guys stopped working for Dennis. And I believe there are people who say, and Dennis had said it, that guys were told don't work for Dennis anymore. I don't know why. I mean, it wasn't like ECW was doing anything at this point. Go watch early ECW.
At that time, Todd Gordon had told them that don't work for Dennis anymore.
Yeah, now go back and watch early ECW. That's ridiculous.
Brian, I've seen it. That's a whole nother discussion that Doc and I have had recently, and you and I kind of had a little bit about it when people not compare Smoky Mountain to ECW because it's two different things, but how Smoky Mountain Wrestling in its entirety is so much better than ECW in its entirety because there is stuff out there with ECW that is worse than the worst independents. And I'm not trying to make anyone mad. I'm just, when you watch it, it's just like, what am I watching? Again, not to offend anyone in ECW. That's not my point here. But I agree. I know where you're coming from when you say that. But I didn't.
Well, I'm not even saying it for that reason, though. I'm not even saying it just like, oh, look at it, it's not good. I'm saying look at it and look at those crowds. And to me, you can't really justify telling a guy, hey, you can work here, but when we're off and we're not running, you can't work for this other guy across the river. Like, to me, that's where it gets silly. But there was a lot of silliness in the feud between Dennis Carluzzo and ECW.
Okay, so that makes sense, what you're saying right there, because that happened in Southern Indies that I'm familiar with. I won't say names, but it's like sometimes
say names.
Nah, it's just sometimes indie promoters, some of them just think they're.
Are you going to make a comeback?
No, it's just
say names. We want names.
No, I'm not saying names because you're talking about just stupid people who just do stupid shit, and they don't need their names thrown out there to get any more publicity than they would already got while they were living their dream supposedly 20 years ago, and that's that. But
you hear that, Iceman Parsons?
No, it's not. It's nothing to do with Iceman. Speaking of which,
let me take you back though to what I'm saying, because I think there's an important part that I'm missing. I'm telling you what's happening in Philadelphia, right?
Right.
Todd Gordon's running in Philly. He's running these bar shows. Eventually, he starts running at whatever it is, Cabrini College for the television tapings. Eventually, they find the ECW arena by the summer of '93, maybe the spring of '93, but definitely the summer of '93. At this same time, Dennis Carluzzo has been running these indie shows. In '93, he runs these two major indie shows, NWA Grand Slam and NWA Grand Slam 2 in Minnesota. NWA Grand Slam 1 had what was a dream match at that time for tape traders. The Lightning Kid, right before he became the 1-2-3 Kid, versus Sabu. And you had Terry Funk versus Road Warrior Hawk. I mean, these were like the indie superstars. This is right when Sabu was really blowing up. And by the way, Dennis was using Sabu before ECW, and Sabu's a guy who had to stop working for Dennis and eventually did go back and work for Dennis when ECW kind of kicked him out for a while. And, I think, there's another example of a guy that Dennis was using. But 93, Dennis is running big shows like that. He also had joined the NWA. And that was the interesting little wrinkle in this whole story, is that now you have the NWA in the mix. NWA had been really non-existent for a little while. They brought it back in '92 in WCW with the tag team tournament, the world title tournament. And Dennis joined the NWA. And if you're joining the NWA, you're supposed to be able to get dates on the champion, you're supposed to vote for the champion, and whatever other, perks come with being a member of the NWA. At that point, there weren't too many members. I think it was maybe New Japan, WCW, The Attorney, Dennis, Steve Ricard, and if there's anyone else, I don't remember who. I don't even know if any Mexican promoters were actually paying. They all have NWA in their belts, but I don't think anyone actually pays membership dues. At least they weren't then.
Right.
So at that point, that's all you have. Dennis wants dates on the champion. Dennis wants dates on Ric Flair, and it's not going to happen. And right around this time, WCW and the NWA have their falling out. So now the NWA is up for grabs. And at the same time, Jim Crockett Jr., his non-compete after the sale in 88 to Turner comes up. So now it's the spring of 93. Jim Crockett Jr. is going to do something. People know he's trying to do something. They also know that all of a sudden he's working with Paul Heyman, who's also a free agent. He left WCW, and he's now just back home in upstate New York in Scarsdale, and he's hanging around ECW because his best friend Eddie Gilbert's the booker, and now Paul's there, and Paul's involved in very interesting little projects. He does this one called the WWN, the World Wrestling Network, and they do a television taping in Texas in high definition. This was the first time I had ever heard of high definition television. Was in 1993 on John Arezzi's radio show, Paul Heyman, talking about this television taping they did. It was Bob Orton versus Jake Roberts, and then they had a tag team, the Kimono Dragons, and it was Dean Malenko and Ted Petty, Flyboy Rocco Rock under masks. Mm-hmm. And apparently it was just this really cool taping, and it was all shot in HD. That footage has never emerged. So Heyman's doing that, and Heyman links up with Jim Crockett, and Jim Crockett Jr. joins the NWA. So now let's go to late 1993. Everything in ECW changes. Eddie Gilbert's out as booker. We won't get into all the story behind that right now because it's too much time. And his former best friend Paul Heyman is the new booker. And the first thing Paul Heyman does is bring Jim Crockett in. And then ECW goes from Eastern Championship Wrestling to NWA Eastern Championship Wrestling, a member of the NWA, and quite frankly, at that point, the most visible member of the NWA. Even though Eastern Championship Wrestling didn't have much distribution, it was in Philadelphia. The tape started getting around. People started buzzing about ECW because Heyman starts using Sabu, Terry Funk, all these guys who had been working indies for Dennis, all these guys who had been working, Sabu hadn't, but Terry Funk had been working for ECW already. And all of that's happening. And then leading up to the NWA title tournament in 94, I know Dennis wanted Chris Benoit to be the champion. Dennis wanted Chris Benoit to win, and he didn't have the votes to make it happen. And ECW was pretty adamant that they wanted Shane Douglas to win, and Dennis didn't think Shane was the right guy. And you know what? Dennis sucked it up, and he went along with it for the good of the NWA, for the good of everything he had been working towards. And, Dennis he was never the NWA president, and he could have been, I think. He passed it off to Howard Brody. Now, he may have wanted to pass off the responsibility. That may have been part of it. But he wasn't NWA president. He did all this. He resuscitated the NWA. If Dennis hadn't done everything he did, that's a horrible sentence, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
if Dennis had done all of that in 93 and 94, there wouldn't be whatever remnants of the NWA there are today. There wouldn't have been that history for 20 years, that weird history where, Chris Candido and Dan Severn and, Ogawa, just various people who were NWA champions at various points. But leading into that night, Dennis had wanted Benoit. Benoit's in the tournament.
Right.
And Heyman had, because remember, Dennis had used Benoit earlier that year. He had a feud with Benoit and Jerry Lawler. When Jerry Lawler had his issues with his sex accusations, his underage sex accusations, WWE stopped using him. Dennis didn't. And Dennis brought him up to give an award to Chris Benoit, the old Demente Negro angle with Jerry Lawler. Lawler did that with Chris Benoit up here, took off the mask and revealed himself. So Chris Benoit had been working for Dennis, and Dennis liked Benoit. That was his vote. ECW wanted Shane, and ECW had the votes. And then ECW also realized a couple other things. One was Paul Heyman got to the point where I think he said, I really don't want to work with Jim Crockett. Because I think Heyman wants to work wherever Heyman can control. And I'm not blaming him for that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But I think he saw that with Todd Gordon and ECW, that's where he was going to be able to make it happen.
So you actually answered a question that I had about this whole situation because, according to Douglas, there had been shots fired. Douglas talks about times when they were working shows at DCW Arena, and evidently, the fire department was called because there were too many people in the building, and word is that Dennis called the fire department because there's too many people there. Just all kind of little things, or the cars would be papered with Dennis related show material.
Well, yes, that definitely happened.
Well, that shit happens everywhere with every fucking independent.
Someone went on an overpass, I know for a fact, and just threw flyers so that they went everywhere. I know that for a fact. And look, that's what it was. It really was and it's weird to talk about it, but it was a little independent wrestling war on two different sides of the river. ECW was able to fuck with Dennis with power, and Dennis was able to fuck with ECW because Dennis had a crew of morons who were willing to do anything, like Gino Moore, who before they had a falling out, Gino Moore was a guy willing to go in a parking lot and let air out of people's tires. That wasn't Dennis. Dennis wasn't on the ground doing that shit. But people who wanted to make Dennis happy sometimes did do that stuff. Yes, that's
okay,
true.
So you want names. Let me tell you the names of the promotions. Because this same exact shit happened in Louisiana. This same shit by two lesser-known companies that never had TV. There was an organization called the CWF, which was the Cajun Wrestling Federation. I did work for them a few times. There was also another organization called the UWF. Obviously not Watts' UWF. Ultimate Wrestling Federation. And Jesus fucking Christ, these two fucking promoters, they swore they were God's gift to fucking wrestling back in the fucking 90s. And it's just, I can't even describe it. I ain't saying no names, but I did say the organizations. Anybody out there, Google it and you can figure it out if there's info out there about these two. But same shit. I pointed out because it's same shit. Same shit you just said. People, papering, calling buildings, papering fucking cars. Just a typical independent war. I mean, it was what it was. But proceed. I didn't mean to cut you off, but again,
by the way,
same shit.
I was in the ECW arena many times, and I was in there during summer. And I'm not justifying it, but I'm just saying as a point of fact, if someone called the fire marshal and said that building's oversold, it's dangerous, they were probably right. Because I was in there, and I'm not saying I would have done it. I'm not saying that was the right thing, but there were definitely nights in there. It was like, holy shit, it is so hot and it's so packed, and I can't get near a concession to get a drink. I'm going to pass out. But so, that's a true part of it. But look, it was pretty rough. And Dennis's thing was Dennis wanted to get along with everyone. Dennis and Todd didn't get along. Dennis and Paul could have gotten along, and they didn't. And, I think Paul kind of strung Dennis along. Dennis was a patsy in the situation with Douglas winning, and he looked to embarrass Dennis. And
so let me ask you this. I don't mean to cut you off, but so if they didn't get along, if Todd, I think I know the answer because you kind of said it. They were all in the NWA, and it was NWA Eastern Championship Wrestling. If they didn't get along, Dennis really was probably more or less just he trusted, I guess because he had to, because they were in the NWA, he trusted them even after all that quote unquote bad blood with the postering and the call in the fire department, all that stuff. He still, it sounds like he trusted them still to allow the NWA tournament to take place in their backyard, even though they were voting for the guy he didn't want because he got outvoted. I mean, I don't know. I'm listening to your part of it here. It sounds like Dennis was just, for what it's worth, he was very trusting of someone in Gordon that he didn't really trust.
Yes and no, because I had also heard that Dennis may have been tipped off that something was going to happen, and he either didn't believe it or he still wanted to just see it right in front of him, which is what happened. But remember, he wasn't the NWA.
That's true.
And again, I think if Paul Heyman's relationship, if Paul Heyman hadn't realized Jim Crockett wasn't doing shit. Because everyone thought Jim Crockett, what's he going to do? He's Jim Crockett. And he came back and he did a television taping in Chattanooga, and then he ran out of the Sportatorium. Now imagine wrestling in the Sportatorium in 95. It was just with Greg Valentine and Tully Blanchard as your host. Not as the wrestler, but as your host. And he may have wrestled too. I think he may have been the North American champion. But it just, Heyman probably saw that and said, wait a minute. I've got this thing in Philadelphia that it's small, but it's building. And he got what was most valuable to Paul Heyman, which was a devoted audience.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to get that anywhere else.
That's a good point.
And Crockett dried up. I mean, Crockett by 96 he was done, wasn't he?
Dude, I don't even remember. That's how small or insignificant that was at that time. And the funny part is, you got to put yourself in that time frame too. I'm guessing at anything at 93, 94, if you still said the name Jim Crockett Promotions at that time, we aren't that far removed from the heyday. I don't want to call it the heyday, but you know what I mean. The big time, JCP, where it meant something. So I could still see how some people would be like, wait, Crockett's getting back into this thing. We need to give it a look. This could be something positive. But like to the point you made, Paul Heyman saw something building for what it's worth, and he was like, I don't know. This is what we got here is a good thing. He had a hell of a devoted audience to it. That's for damn sure. You can tell from them tapings.
He tried again with the WWN though. They did a second television taping in New York at the Manhattan Center where Monday Night Raw had been filmed. They did a second HD television taping there with Sabu versus Terry Funk in a match that people raved about. There's a bootleg that was a big deal on the tape trading scene at that point in the 90s. But that was a second taping. So even when he got the ECW gig, he was still fooling around with the WWN with the television producer he was working with. And again, I wish those HD films or whatever they have, I wish they would come to life. Yeah, I really do. I'd love to see that stuff.
Yeah, that would be incredible to get your hands on that.
And then from that point on, I mean, look, then it was a real feud. Dennis does the NWA tournament in November. ECW runs against them. So now they're running the same night, opposite sides of the river. ECW this is the night where there's a settlement from WCW doing something. I forget which time Paul threatened a lawsuit. It may have been over the name of a pay-per-view. They got Sherry Martel to return for a night, Kevin Sullivan, and they were going to get Steve Austin, I think, and they got Brian Pillman, I want to say.
And I want to go back to the night he threw the belt down, but just for clarification purposes, you're talking about the second tournament that Dennis held on his
November
card
19th.
In November.
November 19th, 94. ECW runs against him that same night with a really big show. And Dennis, of course, has the NWA tournament, Smoky Mountain Wrestling up, Eddie Gilbert. And again, there's that dynamic. And really, so much of the feud between ECW and Dennis in a lot of ways shifted to the Eddie Gilbert camp or the Eddie Gilbert supporters or the people who think Eddie Gilbert got a really raw deal and the Paul Heyman supporters. For a few years there, that was the big deal. I mean, every year when they did an Eddie Gilbert memorial show, someone made a shot about ECW. And sometimes it was Eddie's family. I mean, it was very personal still that Heyman, in their eyes, had screwed Eddie over, and now Eddie was no longer here. So a lot of that feud kind of shifted to that. And then every year they would, 1 year the Eddie Gilbert Memorial, I believe, was the weekend of the first ECW pay-per-view event because I went to both of them. I was in town for both. So, I mean, it really got to a point where even though, it's not exactly the Monday Night Wars, Dennis would run a big show and sometimes ECW would have a big show either the same night or the next night within just, not too many miles of each other.
And what's funny about that time frame is, I mean, we didn't start getting ECW until later in 95. So the time, it's funny because you had that groundswell where ECW was building, but the time period you're talking about, I don't know if people realize ECW wasn't the ECW that I guess the majority of people started seeing. Like, I don't know if people really realize that in 94. Like, I don't know what their reach was in 94. I know they went to Florida in 94 as well. I think
in 94 they got on the Sunshine Network. So they're on Philadelphia Sports Channel. They're on the Sunshine Network in Florida. In January 95, they debuted on the MSG channel, Madison Square Garden Television in New York, which is a premium cable channel. But it was on, I want to say it was on 2 in the morning. May have been 3, but it was on 2 in the morning. And I would stay up and I would tape it on 2-hour tapes for quality. And then I didn't give a shit about school or anything else. I was going to watch ECW. And those early 95 shows were really cool. I mean, it was really when ECW was establishing itself as being really different And it was able to do that for a couple of years. It was like Mikey Whipwreck and Paul Loria, where Paul Loria jumps out of the crowd and attacks his former friend because one's, no longer the undercard guy. And it was cool stuff. But the feud between Dennis and ECW went on for a number of years. And then a lot of these guys, when Paul wouldn't use him anymore, they would all come back and Dennis would use him again. Public Enemy, Pit Bulls, Big Dick Dudley, John Cronus, 911, all these guys, they all eventually worked for Dennis again after they couldn't get booked for ECW.
I remember you saying that before. You either told me that before or said it on the 605 or Cornette's show. I can't remember which one. Let me ask you this question about it. So did Dennis despise Douglas more for what happened when he threw the belt down at the tournament? Or was his problem more with Todd Gordon and Paul Heyman? Did he ever have any discussions with you about that?
No, but I think all three were probably certainly lumped together and not on his Christmas card list.
I can see why that would be that way.
He never specified the one based on that one time. Again, I didn't really become friends with him for another year and a half or so. First time I met him, I didn't like him because I thought he was, at his show, they were spending too much time bashing ECW, but I also didn't understand everything that had gone down. But I really didn't get to start having long conversations with him until, I don't know, maybe the end of 95.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? A year later. It's funny because Douglas claims, besides that night at the ECW arena in the finals, he claims he had no other discussions with Dennis before that night or after that night, which I guess makes sense. I mean, if he's going to say that, sure. You and I were having a discussion about what he claimed were some words that Dennis said on air on Mike Tenay's show. Neither one of us have heard that interview where Dennis supposedly had kind of, according to Douglas, Dennis bashed Douglas on that radio station. So I just thought it was interesting that Shane Douglas says the only time he ever talked to Dennis was that night. He never had any other talks before or after, which I don't know, maybe to me feels weird, but I got to take him for his word. I wasn't there, and that's that. You know what I mean?
There's a lot of weird energy in the air around that time, and I believe that. The Wrestling Insiders thing, I don't know. We used to get Mike Tenay's show out of like a radio station upstate New York. We'd be able to pick it up, on a real distant feed. It would go in and out. We got Mike Tenay's show in 93. I used to listen to it and in 94. And I don't remember Shane Douglas on it. So it may have, or Dennis on it. So it may have happened and I just don't remember. But, again, Dennis wasn't the NWA. Dennis was there and he was certainly a big part of it, but he wasn't the NWA president. Now, he would have gotten dates on Shane Douglas as champion. That's where it becomes weird. Like, okay, you're not going to talk to him or anything, and you're going to use the guy. But Shane wasn't his pick. And Dennis had an idea something fishy was going on, and turned out something fishy was going on.
Which is, Douglas claims, if you ever listen to his interviews, Shane Douglas claims that even when he won the belt and started giving that promo, he claims up until that moment, he wasn't quite sure that he was going to throw the belt down. And I don't have the quotes, but I'll say this. I remember hearing the interview with him where he says, Dennis had bugged him earlier that night a bunch of times about signing the contract. Specifically signing a contract for the NWA. It bugged him. And he just was feeling very uneasy about that. And Douglas claims...
Bugged him. You're putting the belt on the guy. You say it like he's just some, guy there. Hey, listen, we're going to put the belt on you and run with you. You got to sign this contract. I mean...
Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. Well, that's what he said. And he says when... He said this on the Two-Man Power Trip podcast. He says... Douglas, it came out of his mouth. He said, right before he threw the belt down, he said he can see Dennis out of the corner of his eye sitting in the audience. And he's like, yeah, you know what? I'm throwing this belt down. And then he goes on with that promo that, everybody knows now because it's, I guess, quote unquote famous. But I don't know. Had you ever heard that part of it from Shane Douglas?
I've heard that that's Shane's story. I don't know what's true, what isn't. I'm not saying he isn't telling the truth. I don't know enough about it. Dennis was definitely at ringside, not sitting with the fans. He was standing at ringside. You'll see him on the video with his mouth open, as Shane, throws down the belt. And in terms of he didn't know he was going to do it, I don't know. I mean, they rebranded the entire fucking. Oh, am I allowed to use profanity on your program?
It's the unprofessional fucking wrestling.
I just want to make sure.
Yes,
but they rebranded the whole fucking company. It went for the next episode was, we are no longer Eastern Championship Wrestling. We are now Extreme Championship Wrestling.
Oh no, they do it that episode. Well, I mean, it's pre-taped, but they do it that episode.
So I mean, I don't know. The idea that he wasn't going to do it, and then it would have been, we're Extreme, and here's the NWA champion, Shane Douglas. I don't know. I kind of think he knew exactly what he was going to do. 100%.
You know what's crazy? That it aired like 2 days after the tournament. So like that, I know people go, oh, what's the big deal? That was during a day and age still where, it wasn't uncommon for taping to take place and it not air until a week later or longer. I mean, we're still in a different world back then in '94. We're still pre-internet for the most part. I mean, there was the internet, but it not wide scale. You're still pre-internet, man. You're still in a different world. So yeah, they turned that shit around in 2 weeks. And then at the end, you got the whole deal. I don't know if you remember it, but Public Enemy is spray painting. Eastern has already been spray painted through, and Johnny Grunge is spraying Extreme under Eastern on the banner. So did you remember that?
Yeah, I remember that. It's also interesting. Dennis was the one promoter they never spoofed from the Northeast. Joel Goodhart became Joel Hartgood. I'm trying to remember now. They spoofed a few different local Pennsylvania promoters or New Jersey promoters and had job guys with that name, but they never did that for Dennis.
Interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
And again, all these guys that worked for Dennis ended up going there. Dennis discovered Chris Candido. Dennis was the first guy in America in the Northeast to really start using Sabu. And so many of the local guys all started with Dennis, and then they would all cut him off because ECW, and then Paul Heyman would pretend like there wasn't anything going on, and then there would be, and then it was all, I don't know. Let's put it this way. There were some people on drugs, and I'll let everyone figure out who.
Yeah, you got that right. Hey, I'm sure you've seen it. Have you? It may have been a while. Dennis's quote-unquote promo at the end of that episode when Douglas threw the belt down.
Yeah, that's another interesting part of the story. Yeah.
What did you think about that?
I think Dennis was trying to save face in some way for himself, for the NWA. It's a weird situation. I had heard that there may have been more than one take, which tells me someone wasn't happy with what it was, and I don't know who. But again, imagine if you're there, it's going to be a big night for something you've been working for. You're not getting what you want, but you're doing what's best for everyone else. You get screwed live. You're at ringside. It's happening in front of all the fans. A lot of these fans know you. A lot of these fans, there were fans there who didn't like Dennis. There are fans there who had attended Dennis's shows. It was happening in front of everyone. And then he goes in the back, and now he's in foreign territory, and they stick a camera in his face to do a promo for the show. I don't know. I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know if that situation is ripe for thinking, or if it's just kind of a reflex. You do what you do and you get out of there. I don't know. It's a weird thing, but I think it's Dennis trying to save face. Okay.
Yeah, I was curious if he had ever kind of talked to you about it at all. Because it's strange when now that you look back at it all these years later and you hear from somebody like Shane Douglas, who obviously was there, and you got to take it for what it's worth. I don't know. I mean, he's speaking of it from his perspective. I'm not calling. I don't know him. I don't know if he's lying. I don't know what he's telling the truth on. He's speaking from it or about it in his own perspective, and it's just curious. It makes me curious to think, if Dennis was still here, I would love to ask him that question. Like, what are you thinking when that goes down, but then when the camera is stuck in your face, because now it looks like a masterful acting job on his part, but you just never know. And then you're mentioning this thing where they may have done 2 takes. So that makes me wonder, wow, so he cut one and then cut another. So how much of what he was doing was working? Am I making sense, Brian?
Yeah,
Or
there's a shoot interview he did. I haven't seen it in many, many years. There were parts of it that were just ridiculous and hysterical. But Dennis did a shoot interview, which I was about to say, but there's no S in the word I'm about to say. But he did it with a Smart Mark Video, and I believe they have it for sale still. So they deserve a plug. The Dennis Carluzzo shoot interview. There is some funny stuff in there.
okay, where he talks about what happened, like that.
I'm pretty sure he talks about everything. And look, if you're going to do a shoot interview with Dennis in, let's say, 99 or 2000, that's going to be one of the main things you ask him.
Oh, I mean it.
So I don't remember what he said, but that's definitely there.
I've also heard that like Todd Gordon, Paul Heyman, and Dennis never really squashed their, I guess, beef before his untimely passing. Is that true to your knowledge?
Yeah, Dennis definitely really didn't like Paul Heyman and definitely let people know what he thought about Paul Heyman. And, there was the one time they almost squashed it where Chris Candido begged Cornette to come to ECW to be a surprise. And Cornette said, "Great, I'll do it. All you have to do is get Paul Heyman to shake hands with Dennis Carluzzo and say that Dennis can use his talent when he's not using them." And Paul Heyman said, "Absolutely no problem. And I'll also send you to dinner." And he sent them to dinner, and Cornette and Dennis got all the expensive cigars off the menu. Just spent a ridiculous amount of Heyman's money, and then went in a limousine to the ECW arena. Heyman and Candido came out to the limo. Everyone shook hands. They squashed everything. Remember, Candido had been like a son to Dennis. Candido was the guy Dennis ended up putting the NWA title on. He had been Dennis's guy before he went to Smoky Mountain Wrestling. He had spent time in Dennis's house. He was like a son to Dennis, and now here he is. He's Paul Heyman's boy, and they squash everything, and within days, it was like it didn't happen. It was right back to where it was for no good reason. So yeah, it never got squashed with Heyman. With Todd Gordon, Dennis tried to work with him after Todd got thrown out of ECW. Dennis did some stuff. I was at the NWA 50th anniversary show where during the day there was a convention, and Todd was there with the Sandman, who has always been his buddy, and a few other guys. And Todd and the Sandman were in the main event angle, NWA versus ECW. Building off this idea of this hatred between the two sides. And the NWA had Doug Gilbert. So now you're throwing in that whole Eddie Gilbert angle into the thing again. It's a Gilbert and the NWA versus Todd Gordon and Team ECW. And then, I don't know, that was during the day. By nighttime, Todd and the Sandman had walked out. So they ended up not being a part of the show. I forget the exact story about what happened, but him and Dennis never got along, and they replaced him. She was at the convention, Missy Hyatt. So then you tie it into the whole story where Todd's gone, Sandman's gone, but now Missy's leading the team. And, there's the whole Missy and the Gilberts hating her, which is a shoot. There was that whole thing. So they played on that with Doug on one side and her on the other. But even then, in 99 or whatever, Dennis and Todd just couldn't get along. And again, after that, Dennis still used a lot of ECW guys like the Pitbulls, and he drew some good houses too. The Pitbulls, Public Enemy, John Cronus. I was at a lot of those shows. I did commentary for one of them.
Yeah, it's so. Let me ask you. You were talking about the whole thing with Cornette. I remember Corny telling that story, even on a drive through the experience. But so they go out to dinner and they do all this. So Heyman and Dennis shake hands. They squash it at that point. Is that what you're saying? They actually do
in the limousine. Yes, in the limousine. Yeah.
But then
in front of Candido and Cornette.
But then right after it's back to same old heat, and ECW guys can't work for Dennis anymore.
Right away.
What year was that? About what year was that? Do you remember?
When Corny made a surprise appearance, I want to say that was 97. I want to say.
That's what I was thinking, but I couldn't quite remember. I didn't know if it was a little bit later than that or not. Okay. Yeah. Wow.
And by the way, for the record, Dennis would have been nothing but happy to not have beef with ECW. Would he have wanted to profit on that relationship by using the guys on their TV when they weren't using them? Absolutely. Absolutely did. He was a promoter.
Right. That's what promoters do.
Dennis would have really liked to have been able to get along with everyone. And it wasn't him. I'll say that.
One last thing, because I forgot to say this earlier when we were talking about, why Dennis, said agreed to, not Dennis, but the NWA agreed to this title tournament with ECW. I forgot to mention this. So Shane Douglas did say in the interview I listened to that, he felt that the NWA was a dead brand, and he felt that Dennis and the ECW crew, so to say, they were just trying to latch on to ECW because what they had going on was dying and not doing well. But if I'm listening to you correct, they were drawing well. Dennis's promotion was drawing well, and that's not necessarily the case, even though ECW did have some momentum at that time.
It's a ridiculous premise. Dennis was drawing all right. ECW was drawing really well, not where they would be in a little while. They were still in their infancy, even though Heyman had been the booker now for about to be one whole year. But it wasn't really again, Dennis wasn't latching on. Dennis helped rejuvenate the NWA. ECW joined the NWA. It wasn't like Dennis showed up and said, "Okay, I'm here, and now let's put the belt on you."
Right.
Dennis, that wasn't Dennis's choice. And to be honest, I don't know how much of that Douglas knows or Douglas doesn't, because he was a top wrestler there, but he wasn't necessarily involved in the conversations between Jim Crockett, between the NWA attorney, between Dennis, Paul Heyman, or anyone else. And to be fair, this is also around the time that Douglas started his whole Flair is dead act. Where it was just, everything that was in the past, everything that prevented Shane Douglas from being the superstar he was always supposed to be. He was going to let you know about it. And that was when those fans all started chanting Flair is dead, which was pretty ridiculous.
That's a fair point that you make, though, about before you're talking about the whole Flair and why he wasn't not Flair, but Douglas, and not the star that he thought he should have been at that point. That's actually a good point you make, because he's assuming he's still talent. He doesn't know all the assuming he doesn't know all the backstory with, Dennis and his conversation with Jim Crockett and all these other things going on in the background. All Shane Douglas knows, maybe at that point, without having spoke to him, is what Paul Heyman is feeding him and telling him, and that could be different, and that could be spun many different ways, because I guess Paul Heyman knows how to spin and work people. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, but you got to understand too, Shane Douglas at that time, and I had enough people I was talking to were kind of in the know at that time that I knew this was at least what people were saying. Whether it's true or not, who knows? But I could tell you that enough people, direct knowledge at that time would have told you that Shane Douglas was a malcontent. The story that people used to always laugh about was, oh, Shane could just quit and go to medical school. Because that's what people would hear. Shane was a teacher when he wasn't wrestling, and he could just give it up and go to medical school because he's smarter than all the average wrestlers. That was what you would hear. The reputation was Shane was a bit of a malcontent, and that, he would act like, he was lowering himself in many ways to continue to do wrestling instead of something else. So whether it's true or not, I don't know. But I could definitely say that was his reputation amongst insiders and even people in business back then.
Gotcha. Well, Brian, this has been an interesting discussion, man. Like I said, I went down the rabbit hole of listening to some interviews and found myself watching that or rewatching that episode of 94 ECW at the end of August with the tournament. Definitely interesting, man. I mean, that was an interesting time. You've made the point many times about if someone could write a book on independent wrestling. I mean, that would be like a great time. That's the time period we're talking here, where you got, indies were fighting. I'm just saying, you saw it up there, I saw it down south. It wasn't just in those two locations. Trust me on that one. Indies were fighting, and it was just a different time, man. It's a different time and a different place. Just some interesting stuff, man. 94, 95, that was a weird time, dude. Weird times.
Yes, it was.
And I got the cornet drive-through gimmick played in my ear just now.
I have so many musical instruments now around me. Some of them are not plugged in, but I have all sorts of variety of different sounds I could demonstrate at any time.
That's really classy. I'm glad you found the need to do that just now. Anything else we need to talk about before I let you out of here and we wrap this puppy up?
Mid-South podcast still coming. A little bit delayed, 100% because of me. My move ended up being a really big move and a pain in the neck. And I could also say that Cowboy Bill Watts was very happy to hear about the upcoming podcast.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I had sent you a message. That was hearing Watts talk about Bruno, stuff that I have no clue about, it was pretty good. That was riveting, man. I enjoyed that part of the Bruno tribute. Watts was, man, dude, I could sit down with him. If I really sat down and went through the years of Mid-South that we're doing, I could sit down with him for probably a week straight and still not get through half of it. And I mean 24 hours a day when I say a week straight.
Yeah. No, I talked to him for, I think, maybe 40 minutes on the air and then another 90 minutes off air. And it was just, I was in heaven because he's so smart and he remembers everything. And you really kind of can get into the philosophy, the process of thought for decisions that were made many years ago. And as someone who would, an appreciation of business, I very much enjoy that.
I can't wait. I can't wait to for the episodes to drop and with Watts appreciating what we're working on. That's a good thing. I'm glad to hear that.
I consider that the seal of approval right there. We couldn't release it unless we had the blessing of the cowboy.
The blessing of the cowboy. Amen. All right, Brian, anything else before we get out of here? This isn't going to air for probably about another week, maybe two. So we're looking at May 9th, May 16th, somewhere around there. Anything you want to plug in that time frame, man?
That seems like an excessive delay for a show to come out. That's unforgivable. You horrible, horrible man. Stick to a schedule, you derelict.
That's
demand
funny.
My free show when I want it. And that is now. I release this tomorrow. ECW got this show in 2 days. Why do we gotta wait a week for this shit?
Because I said so. I'm the fucking producer.
All right,
and it's my shit, so I'm saying so. How's that sound?
That's a good reason. Honestly, I thank you for inviting me on your show again. Every time I've done your show, those 2 times years and years ago, and the one I got the other day, and now I'm back here. Every time it's a lot of fun. So thank you for inviting me. I very much appreciate it, and thank you to all the BTT Army who I know also support the Super Podcast. Not everyone. I'm sure there are people who hate me. But a good portion of the audience listen to the Super Pod as well. So thank you to everyone for that. And who else do I need to thank? I feel like I'm accepting an award. I don't know why
you always do that when you get to the end of being on my show. You start like you're accepting an Academy Award. This is nothing new. You do this all the time.
Well, I'm trying to demonstrate. I'm trying to give you so much action. You just can't wait a week and a half, whatever you said, a month. I forget what you said before you release this show. So I'm trying to just really pack it with action.
I was thinking 2019, maybe. Does that sound?
That's the next episode of the Super Podcast. So get a set date so we don't compete. No. But seriously, Mid-South Podcast coming soon. And if you're listening to this Super Podcast coming soon, and I shouldn't announce who's any of the guests or the co-hosts because this is coming out 2 weeks later, and I'm usually on a little bit of a delay, so this will just completely blow my mind if I try to guess what will be on the show then. So, listen to the Super Podcast at 605pod.com or wherever you find your favorite podcasts, iTunes, Podcast Addict, Stitcher. Not on Spotify. I'm not doing that yet. I'm thinking about it, though. You do Spotify, Mike?
I don't. It's funny you asked that. I haven't put it on Spotify yet. I need to do a little bit more research on that. Yeah,
we'll see. Maybe there's, but everywhere else, you just go find us. Tally ho.